Silence. Then music. Then 300 people who have spent months preparing for this single night. New York City, March 26, 1883. The temperature outside hovers just above freezing. On Fifth Avenue, carriages have been arriving since 9 o'clock. Horses breathe steam into the cold air. Coachmen in livery hold their lines with practiced stillness. Gas lamps throw amber circles on the wet pavement. Inside 660 Fifth Avenue, the most expensive private home in New York City, Alva Vanderbilt stands at the entrance of her ballroom in a costume designed to look like a Venetian princess from the 16th century. She spent $250,000 on tonight, $65,000 on champagne alone, $11,000 on flowers. The rooms smell of hothouse roses and French perfume and money. The specific smell of money when it has stopped trying to prove itself and has simply become the air everyone breathes. Every chandelier blazes. The musicians are already playing. 720 guests have been invited from across the American elite, railroad men and their wives, industrial fortunes of the newest generation, old families who have decided that Alva Vanderbilt, whatever they think of her, cannot be ignored. One name is missing from that list, not by accident. 3 blocks away, in the most powerful private residence on Fifth Avenue, the woman whose name is missing sits in her receiving room and understands, for the first time in her life, that someone has just done to her what she has spent 30 years doing to everyone else. Her name is Caroline Astor. She is the woman who decided who mattered in America. And tonight, for the price of a party invitation, her world begins to end. The question this story will answer is not simply how she fell. The fall is almost the least interesting part. The question is this: what does it cost, truly cost, to spend a life deciding who matters, and what happens when the system you built turns around and uses itself against you? If you enjoyed deep investigations into Gilded Age families and the architecture they built and destroyed, please like this video, subscribe to Ledger and Stone, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Now, let's begin. 350 Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, 1870. A 4-story brownstone on the corner of 34th Street. From the outside, it does not announce itself. No towers, no theatrical facade, no limestone carved by Italian stonemasons fresh from the Loire Valley. It is, by the standards of what is coming, by the standards of Newport and the palaces that will rise on this same street within a decade, almost modest. Do not be deceived. Walk through the front entrance. Follow the hallway past the dining room, past the drawing rooms connected by sliding doors, past the statue of Venus standing in pale marble against the wall. Follow it all the way to the rear of the house. And stop. The ballroom stretches across the entire back of the building, rising 4 stories to the roof. It is the largest private ballroom in New York. The walls are hung in satin panels, each one a backdrop for paintings collected from across Europe and America, canvases that in any other city would anchor a museum. The floor is parquet hardwood, covered in 4 massive red oriental carpets and 16 long, narrow Persian rugs. In certain corners, woven rugs feature peacock feathers worked into the pattern with such care that the feathers seem to catch the light. Look up. 4 crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling, each one enormous, each one dripping with cut glass, catching the gaslight and throwing it across the room in fragments. Between them, connecting chandelier to chandelier across the expanse of the ceiling, strings of pearls have been hung like garlands. Not paste, not imitation. Pearls. At the far end of the room, a marble fireplace holds Louis XVI candelabra. In front of it, raised on a small dais covered in fur blankets, sits a red satin divan. Not a chair, a throne. Every ball, every season, every year, Caroline Astor descended her staircase, crossed this room, and took her position on that dais. She received, she did not circulate. Guests arrived, guests waited, guests approached when the moment was appropriate, when the social calculus had been performed. And then, if you had been judged worthy, if your name was the right kind of name, if your bloodline reached back far enough, if your money was old enough to have lost the smell of the work that made it, Mrs. Astor acknowledged you. She did not go to you, you came to her. The musicians were hidden at the opposite end of the room, behind Chinese lacquer screens placed across the musicians' gallery opening onto the ballroom from the second floor. An orchestra played. The music appeared to come from the walls themselves, as if the building were performing, as if the house understood its purpose and participated willingly. There was a marble waterfall near the gallery. The sound of it, quiet, continuous, civilized, ran under the music all evening. The footmen who moved through the room wore green plush coats, white breeches, black silk stockings, and gold buckles at the knee. Their vests were red whipcord. The buttons on their livery bore the Astor coat of arms engraved with the family motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. 18 permanent staff maintained this house year-round. For the annual ball, the event that defined the social season in New York, up to 125 additional caterers and servers were engaged. Food came on silver and gold plate. The champagne was the best available. The flowers were arranged by professionals who understood that a wrong arrangement could read as carelessness. The polka was banned, too vulgar. And Mrs. Astor herself wore, at the center of her gown, a jeweled stomacher, an ornamental piece that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who had been dragged to the guillotine by forces she could not control, whose world had been swept away by people who decided they were no longer willing to wait outside the gates. Caroline Astor wore her jewelry as decoration. She did not yet see it as a warning. 350 Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, 1870. A 4-story brownstone on the corner of 34th Street. From the outside it does not announce itself. No towers, no theatrical facade, no limestone carved by Italian stonemasons fresh from the lower valley. It is, by the standards of what is coming, by the standards of Newport and the palaces that will rise on this same street within a decade, almost modest. Do not be deceived. Walk through the front entrance. Follow the hallway past the dining room, past the drawing rooms connected by sliding doors, past the statue of Venus standing in pale marble against the wall. Follow it all the way to the rear of the house. And stop. The ballroom stretches across the entire back of the building, rising 4 stories to the roof. It is the largest private ballroom in New York. The walls are hung in satin panels, each one a backdrop for paintings collected from across Europe and America, canvases that in any other city would anchor a museum. The floor is parquet hardwood, covered in 4 massive red oriental carpets and 16 long, narrow Persian rugs. In certain corners, woven rugs feature peacock feathers worked into the pattern with such care that the feathers seem to catch the light. Look up. 4 crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling, each one enormous, each one dripping with cut glass, catching the gaslight and throwing it across the room in fragments. Between them, connecting chandelier to chandelier across the expanse of the ceiling, strings of pearls have been hung like garlands. Not paste, not imitation. Pearls. At the far end of the room, a marble fireplace holds Louis XVI candelabra. In front of it, raised on a small dais covered in fur blankets, sits a red satin divan. Not a chair, a throne. Every ball, every season, every year, Caroline Astor descended her staircase, crossed this room, and took her position on that dais. She received. She did not circulate. Guests arrived. Guests waited. Guests approached when the moment was appropriate, when the social calculus had been performed. And then, if you had been judged worthy, if your name was the right kind of name, if your bloodline reached back far enough, if your money was old enough to have lost the smell of the work that made it, Mrs. Astor acknowledged you. She did not go to you. You came to her. The musicians were hidden. At the opposite end of the room, behind Chinese lacquer screens placed across the musicians' gallery opening onto the ballroom from the second floor, an orchestra played. The music appeared to come from the walls themselves, as if the building were performing, as if the house understood its purpose and participated willingly. There was a marble waterfall near the gallery. The sound of it, quiet, continuous, civilized, ran under the music all evening. The footmen who moved through the room wore green plush coats, white breeches, black silk stockings, and gold buckles at the knee. Their vests were red whipcord. The buttons on their livery bore the Astor coat of arms, engraved with the family motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. 18 permanent staff maintained this house year-round. For the annual ball, the event that defined the social season in New York, up to 125 additional caterers and servers were engaged. Food came on silver and gold plate. The champagne was the best available. The flowers were arranged by professionals who understood that a wrong arrangement could read as carelessness. The polka was banned, too vulgar. And Mrs. Astor herself wore at the center of her gown a jeweled stomacher, an ornamental piece that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who had been dragged to the guillotine by forces she could not control, whose world had been swept away by people who decided they were no longer willing to wait outside the gates. Caroline Astor wore her jewelry as decoration. She did not yet see it as a warning. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into one of New York's oldest Dutch families. The Schermerhorns had been in New York since the 17th century, not the wealthiest family, not the most powerful in strictly financial terms, but old, ancient by American standards, and in the world Caroline was born into and would spend her entire life defending. Old was everything. Old meant legitimate. Old meant real. Old meant the difference between someone who belonged and someone who had merely arrived. She married William Backhouse Astor, Jr. in 1853. The Astors were wealthy beyond ordinary comprehension. John Jacob Astor, the original patriarch, had built the first great American fortune through fur trading and then through Manhattan real estate, buying and holding and never selling, watching the island grow up around his investments until the land itself was simply printing money. By the time William Jr. inherited his share, the name Astor meant more accumulated wealth than most nations held in their treasuries. It did not automatically mean social acceptance. This was the distinction Caroline Astor spent her life enforcing, the distinction between money and breeding, between what could be made in a generation and what required centuries to accumulate, between the Vanderbilts, whose railroad fortune was so vast it bent the laws of finance, and families like the Schermerhorns and Livingstons and Van Rensselaers, who had been in New York long enough to have watched the British arrive and leave. New money was legitimate in the bank. It was not, by Caroline's judgment, legitimate in her ballroom. In the 1870s, Caroline Astor, in partnership with a man named Ward McAllister, began codifying something that had previously existed only as unspoken consensus. She and McAllister identified the families that mattered, the ones with the right bloodlines, the right addresses, the right amount of social history behind them. They were not merely creating a guest list, they were building the architecture of American aristocracy, an invisible structure as precise and deliberate as any building on Fifth Avenue, and considerably harder to demolish. They called it the 400. The number came from the capacity of Caroline's ballroom. Approximately 400 people in reasonably comfortable circumstances could gather in that room. The number was convenient, but it was also a social instrument. A line drawn in the air, invisible but absolute, enforced not by law, but something more powerful than law, the collective agreement of the people inside the line that the line was real. You were in, or you were not. For the families outside, the new industrial fortunes, the men who had made their money in steel and oil and railroads within a single lifetime rather than across generations, the 400 was a source of humiliation as specific and practical as a locked door. They had more money, in many cases considerably more money. They had enormous houses, they had jewels and servants and carriages, and every material indicator of the kind of life that should, by any reasonable standard, have qualified them for the rooms they wanted to enter. But Caroline Astor was not operating by any reasonable standard. She was operating by her own standard, and her standard said, "Not yet, not until the money is old enough. Not until your grandchildren can present themselves without the smell of the factory still on them." The wall held, for a time, because everyone agreed to agree that it was there. Alva Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1853, into a family whose fortunes had been wrecked by the Civil War. She came north after the war with her parents, landing in a New York that had no particular reason to welcome her. She was Southern, she was not wealthy, she was not connected. She had intelligence and will and an understanding of how social systems actually operate that was considerably less sentimental than Ward McAllister's and considerably more dangerous. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875. The Vanderbilt money was, by this point, among the largest private fortunes in the world. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built his empire in steamships and then railroads, had cornered markets and crushed competitors with a directness that made other financiers look polite. The fortune he left behind was staggering. But the Vanderbilt name, despite its wealth, had never cracked Caroline Astor's inner circle. The Commodore had been rough-edged, self-made, contemptuous of social niceties. He had once famously suggested that social convention could go to the devil. His grandchildren had the money, they did not yet have the room. Alva Vanderbilt decided to take it. Her method was not the method of those who had tried and failed before her. She did not petition, she did not make the appropriate social calls and hope to be noticed. She did not present herself humbly at the gates of the 400 and wait for an invitation. Her method was to build something so spectacular, so impossible to ignore, so utterly dominant in its financial ambition that ignoring her became more embarrassing than acknowledging her. She commissioned a mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue from Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, who had studied in the ateliers that produced the architects of the Louvre. She filled it with art and furnishings acquired in Europe with Vanderbilt money and Alva's eye. She established a presence on Fifth Avenue that any honest assessment of New York society could not pretend wasn't there. And then she planned a party. The 1883 Costume Ball, March 26, 1883. The preparations took months. The newspapers covered them with the breathless attention usually reserved for wars and natural disasters. Guests spent weeks, in some cases months, designing and commissioning their historical costumes. The young women in Caroline Astor's social world organized elaborate group dances to perform on the evening. Carrie Astor, Caroline's daughter, had been rehearsing for weeks with a group called the Star Quadrille. She had her costume prepared, she was ready. 720 invitations went out. Carrie Astor's name was not on the list. The exclusion was not accidental, and it was not subtle. Alva Vanderbilt had not received a formal social call from Mrs. Astor. In the code of Gilded Age New York, a formal call, a visit, a card left at the door, the physical act of presenting yourself and acknowledging another person's social existence was the foundational gesture of acceptance. It meant, I see you, I acknowledge you, you exist in my social world. Without that gesture from Mrs. Astor, Alva could not, in good conscience, invite her daughter. The rules of the game worked both ways. Caroline had used that rule as a weapon for decades. Now it was being used against her. Carrie Astor had been rehearsing her dance routine for weeks. She wanted, with the intensity that 19-year-olds want things, to attend this ball. She had the costume, she had the steps memorized. She was not going to be allowed in, unless her mother made the call. Caroline Astor instructed her carriage to be brought around. She crossed Fifth Avenue. She presented her card at Alva Vanderbilt's door. Stand at that door for a moment. Understand what that carriage ride felt like. The woman who had spent 30 years determining who was worth acknowledging, making the journey to acknowledge someone she had decided was beneath her. The most powerful social gatekeeper in America, traveling across town because her daughter wanted to dance. The call was made. The card was left. Carrie was invited to the ball. The dance went beautifully. And behind the closed doors of New York society, something that had seemed permanent shifted. New money had forced old money to make the first move. The wall had not been demolished, but a door had been opened, and opened from the outside by someone who wasn't supposed to have a key. The cost of the ball, when the receipts were tallied, $250,000, more than $6 million in today's currency. $65,000 in champagne, $11,000 in flowers, the price of admission to one of the most exclusive social circles in the world. Alva Vanderbilt had purchased her recognition and made Caroline Astor deliver it personally. It was the most efficient use of $250,000 in the history of American social warfare. But Alva was not finished. The Academy of Music on 14th Street had for decades been the center of operatic and social life for the New York establishment. Its boxes were controlled by the old families, the Schermerhorns, the Livingstons, the Beekmans, the Van Rensselaers. When new money tried to buy boxes, they were told there were none available. There were never boxes available. That was the point. Alva Vanderbilt, allied with other new money families who had been similarly excluded, had a simple and devastating response. If the Academy would not sell them boxes, they would build a building that had enough boxes for everyone. They financed the construction of the Metropolitan Opera House, which opened in 1883. It had room for all of them and more. It was larger, more modern, more lavishly appointed than the Academy of Music. The Academy could not survive competing with a building subsidized by the largest private fortunes in America. It closed, and the Met became the center of operatic life in New York and has never surrendered that position. You cannot buy your way into the Academy of Music, so they built a bigger building next door and put the Academy of Music out of business. The message was clear. The Vanderbilt money was not going to wait outside any door very long. Before we follow the men who destroy things, we need to spend a moment with the people who made all of it possible. The people nobody photographed. The people whose names do not appear on the guest lists. The people who made the ballroom possible to use and then disappeared into the service stairs before the guests arrived. At 350 Fifth Avenue, the 18 permanent staff who maintained Caroline Astor's household came in each morning before dawn. The coal fires had to be lit in the main rooms before the household woke. Hot water had to be circulating through the pipes. The silver had to be polished, all of it, regularly, because silver tarnishes, and tarnished silver in a house that hosted the 400 was an unthinkable failure. The chambermaids worked from the top floors down, making beds, emptying basins, replacing linens with the fresh pressed sheets that came from the laundry in the basement. The laundresses, women whose days consisted of boiling water, scrubbing, wringing, hanging, pressing, processed the household's washing in conditions that bore no resemblance to the satin-paneled rooms above them. In the kitchen, the cook and kitchen maids produced 3 meals a day for the family and the staff, plus whatever was required for entertainment. For the annual ball, 125 additional workers were engaged, not servants in the permanent household sense, but caterers and servers who came in for the evening and worked through the night. They carried the champagne that cost $65,000. They arranged the flowers that cost $11,000. They moved through the room in their green plush coats and white breeches, handling the gold plate service, keeping glasses filled, maintaining the precise choreography of a formal evening without a single visible mistake. They were noticed only when something went wrong. When everything went right, and everything always went right, they were part of the furniture. After the guests left, they stayed. They cleared the rooms while the family slept. They washed the gold plate service. They folded the linens. They extinguished the candles and cleaned the wax from the holders. They swept the floors and replaced the rugs if they had been moved. They banked the fires. By the time the household stirred in the morning, the evidence of the evening had been erased, the rooms restored to their daily arrangement, and the temporary workers had been paid their wages and sent home. Their names are not in the history books. Some of them are in the payroll ledgers, but the ledgers are not what survived. What survived is the image. Caroline Astor on her throne, the pearls between the chandeliers, the room full of the 400 people who mattered. The people who made that image possible go unnamed. They always do. There was another battle happening simultaneously, quieter, more personal, conducted entirely within the family. His name was William Waldorf Astor. He was the son of John Jacob Astor III and the direct male heir to the largest portion of the Astor family fortune. He was not Caroline's nephew by blood, she had married into the family, but in the language of that social world, he was her nephew, and she was his aunt, and the relationship had been poisoned from the beginning. William Waldorf was educated in Germany and Italy. He spoke multiple languages. He had genuine intellectual interests that distinguished him from many men of his class, a passion for history and architecture, a serious engagement with European culture that went beyond the collecting habits of the merely wealthy. He had read widely. He had traveled thoughtfully. He came home from Europe with the sensibility of a man who had studied how the old world worked and believed he understood it better than most Americans could. He wanted two things: political legitimacy and to be acknowledged as the head of the Astor family. He received neither. In 1881, William Waldorf ran for Congress. He had the name, he had the money. At this point his fortune was somewhere between $150 and $300 million, depending on the assessment, an almost incomprehensible accumulation even by the standards of the Gilded Age. He had the connections. He ran against a man named Roswell P. Flower. He campaigned, he made the appearances. He submitted to the press attention that political life requires. He lost. The New York Times was not kind. The paper accused his campaign of what it called ignoble subservience to machine dictation, the language of a newspaper that had decided this was not a man the public needed to take seriously. Other papers attacked the Astor family's record as landlords of tenement buildings. The great Astor fortune had been built partly on Manhattan real estate, and some of those properties were among the most overcrowded and deteriorated in the city. Families packed into Astor tenements were not living in the kind of conditions that the heir to those buildings would have found comfortable to discuss. William Waldorf's aloof manner, his European sensibilities, his fundamental difficulty connecting with voters who had no particular reason to care about his European education, all of it became material for press coverage that ranged from skeptical to contemptuous. He tried again, he lost again. He accepted an appointment as U.S. Minister to Italy, a diplomatic posting in Rome, a consolation prize that the State Department offered to wealthy men who had useful names and no immediate purpose. He spent 3 years in Italy, attending to official duties, traveling, studying the art and architecture he loved, trying to decide what a man with everything was supposed to do with himself when everything turned out to be insufficient. The social battle with Caroline continued across the Atlantic in letters and dispatches. She was Mrs. Astor. She had established that claim through 2 decades of annual balls and ruthless social management, and she had no intention of surrendering it. His wife, Mamie Astor, believed the title should pass to her, that as the wife of the male heir, she was the rightful Mrs. Astor. Caroline disagreed, and Caroline's disagreement was not a thing that could be easily overruled. He was Willy Wally. The newspapers had given him that name, and it stuck with the specific cruelty of a nickname that catches something true about the person it attaches to. William Waldorf Astor, worth hundreds of millions, carrying one of the most famous surnames in America, educated in the finest institutions of 2 continents, was Willy Wally, a figure of mild ridicule, a man whose ambitions exceeded his ability to make other people take him seriously. In 1890, his father died. William Waldorf Astor inherited the largest single portion of the Astor fortune. He was now, by any financial measure, the dominant Astor in America. He controlled more money than Caroline. He held more property. He was, in any strictly rational accounting, the head of the family. She still would not acknowledge him. He made a decision that had been building in him for years, accumulating frustration by frustration, political defeat by social slight, until the weight of it had become something he could no longer carry. He was leaving, not temporarily, not for a diplomatic posting. He was leaving America. He was going to England, where he had spent enough time to know that the English aristocracy, whatever its faults, operated according to rules he understood, and in which his money and his manner would find an appropriate place. Before he left, he made a statement to the press that would ring across the Atlantic in both directions for years afterwards. America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live. He elaborated. America was suitable, he said, for men who needed to make a living, but why a traveled person of independent means should remain in the country for more than a week was not, in his view, readily comprehensible. The American press erupted with the fury of a nation that had been insulted by one of its own. Kansas City organizations registered satirical illustrations mocking him with the Copyright Office. The major newspapers called him a coward, an ingrate, a man who had been given everything by America and now was spitting on it from the safety of his steamship. They called him Willy Wally, and in that name they put everything they thought of him. He sailed for England, and he was already thinking about what he was going to do with the house. His father's house, the property at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, directly adjacent to Caroline Astor's mansion. His property, his decision entirely. He picked up a pen. Demolish the house. Build a hotel. 1893, Manhattan. The construction crews arrived at the corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd Street and began dismantling the Astor family home. It was not a quiet process. It was never going to be a quiet process. The demolition of a brownstone in the middle of the most exclusive residential block in America was, by its nature, an event. The kind of event that drew onlookers and that could not be ignored by the woman living in the house directly next door. Then the hotel began to rise. 13 stories, a building of commercial scale on 5th Avenue, where nothing of commercial scale had previously been permitted to exist. William Waldorf had chosen a hotel specifically, not an office building that could be dismissed as a matter of investment necessity, not apartments, those were at least residential in purpose, a hotel, a building whose entire reason for existing was to bring strangers through the most exclusive address in New York City, a building that operated on the premise that anyone with money was welcome. The message required no interpretation. If I cannot live next to you on terms I find acceptable, I will make living next to me impossible. Caroline Astor's response was one word: fury. She called it an invasion of commerce into her private sanctuary. She was correct. Technically, this was precisely what it was. She could not stop it. The law protected William Waldorf's right to build what he chose on property he owned. And whatever she thought of him, she had never managed to make the law care about her feelings. She held on for a year. Imagine that year. The construction noise arriving before dawn each morning, penetrating the walls of 350 Fifth Avenue, the dust, the crowds of workers, the machinery, the 13-story building rising floor by floor outside the windows of the ballroom where she had held court for 2 decades. The knowledge that the most powerful woman in New York City was helpless to stop a man she had dismissed from her social world from literally building his revenge next door. She stayed. She hosted her balls. She descended her staircase and took her position on her dais. She sat on her throne with the pearls and the chandeliers above her, and the sounds of William Waldorf's hotel going up beyond the wall. But everyone who attended those balls could hear the construction, and everyone understood what it meant. Eventually, because the alternative was to remain in an increasingly untenable position, Caroline Astor accepted what could not be changed. She commissioned a new mansion. At the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, a French Renaissance double house was designed for her, grander, more theatrical, with a ballroom that could hold over 1,000 guests. The new world demanded new scale. She left 355th Avenue. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, acted immediately. He demolished the house his mother had left, the house that had held her throne, her red satin divan, her crystal chandeliers with their strings of pearls. He cleared the site completely, and on that ground he built the Astoria Hotel, 17 stories, 4 stories taller than William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel directly adjacent. A man responding to his cousin's 13-story act of revenge with a 17-story act of escalation. 2 family members who detested each other, 2 hotels, 1 address. The business logic was obvious even through the personal hatred. 2 separate hotels competing for the same guests on the same block was wasteful. 2 connected hotels sharing resources, staff, kitchens, reservations, and reputation, that was something else. A dominant, singular entity that could attract the most significant guests in the world. Negotiations proceeded. 2 enemies sitting across a table working out the terms of a corridor. In 1897, the hotels were connected by a 300-foot marble passageway, Peacock Alley. The name came from what happened there. Women in their finest silk dresses moved through the corridor between the 2 hotels, visible to everyone seated at the tables and chairs along the walls, performing the theater of being seen. Men in evening clothes, politicians, industrialists, visiting royalty, the wealthy and the aspiring and the merely curious, all moving through 300 feet of marble in their best possible presentation of themselves. The wealthy flocked here to be witnessed. The public came to witness them. The Waldorf Astoria became, within years of opening, the most famous hotel in the world. Its dining rooms and ballrooms hosted presidents and kings, financiers and celebrities, anyone wealthy enough and notable enough to secure a reservation. Its kitchens invented dishes, eggs Benedict, the Waldorf salad, that entered the permanent canon of American cuisine. Its manager, George Bolt, built it into something that neither of its creators had been capable of imagining when they commissioned it out of spite. A monument to family hatred had become a monument to American hospitality. And somewhere in England, William Waldorf Astor read the reports of the hotel's success and understood that his revenge had accidentally created something magnificent. Behind Peacock Alley, the invisible people worked. The Waldorf Astoria employed hundreds, bellboys who carried luggage up 17 floors in elevators that were new enough to still feel miraculous, chambermaids who turned over 100 rooms a day, stripping and remaking beds, replacing linens, removing the physical evidence of one guest before the next arrived, cooks and kitchen workers who operated in the industrial-scale kitchens below the public floors, producing meals for dining rooms that served anyone with the price of a plate, waiters who had memorized the preferences of regular guests, doormen who stood in all weather and opened carriage doors, then automobile doors for people who did not see them as people. They came from the neighborhoods just beyond 5th Avenue, from the crowded streets of the East Side, from communities that would never have been admitted to Caroline Astor's ballroom 3 blocks away, would never have been considered for the 400, would have been among the millions on the wrong side of the wall that McAllister had built. They worked in the building that stood where the wall had been. They served at tables where the 400 had danced. The wall hadn't exactly come down, but the address had changed its meaning entirely. Before we follow Caroline to her ending, we need to stay with Alva Vanderbilt for a moment longer, because the woman who had broken the wall paid a price that the history books often understate. In 1895, 12 years after the costume ball, 12 years after she had forced Caroline Astor's carriage to her door, Alva Vanderbilt did something that shocked her social world more profoundly than any party could have. She divorced her husband. William Kissam Vanderbilt, the man whose name and whose fortune had given her everything. She cited his adultery. She was one of the most prominent women in America. Divorce among the elite was not simply a social scandal. It was a declaration that you considered yourself above the rules that governed everyone else. Alva, it turned out, did. But the divorce was not the most shocking thing she did that year. The most shocking thing was what she did to her daughter. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old in 1895. She was in love with a man named Winthrop Rutherford, a young man of good family and good looks and no particular title. She wanted to marry him. She had, in the way of 18-year-old women in love, given the matter a considerable amount of thought and arrived at a firm conclusion. Alva had a different plan. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, needed money. His estates at Blenheim Palace were deteriorating. His family had title and history and the specific social weight that the British aristocracy carried, the weight that Alva Vanderbilt had been pursuing in one form or another since she arrived in New York with nothing but intelligence and will. A duke, for her daughter, the ultimate acquisition. Consuelo refused. Alva locked her in her room. She threatened to kill Rutherford if Consuelo attempted to see him. She told her daughter that her refusal was causing her mother to suffer a fatal heart attack, and that if Alva died, Consuelo would carry that death on her conscience for the rest of her life. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895. 300 police officers managed the crowd outside the church. The newspapers called it the wedding of the century. The photographs show a bride in a magnificent gown, accompanied by a duke who needed her money, surrounded by guests who understood exactly what was happening. Consuelo cried throughout the ceremony. Guests assumed she was moved by the emotion of the occasion. She was not. The financial terms were explicit. $2.5 million in railroad stock transferred to the Duke at the time of the marriage, approximately $91 million in today's currency, paid for a title, for the legitimacy that no amount of costume balls or forced social calls had been able to fully purchase. The marriage was a long and documented misery. It ended in divorce years later. Alva eventually admitted what she had done and testified in favor of the annulment. Consuelo wrote about it in her memoir. She called it The Glitter and the Gold. She meant both things. The new mansion on 65th Street was everything the one on 34th Street had been, and more. French Renaissance architecture on the outside, a grander ballroom within, one that could hold over 1,000 guests if the occasion demanded, new chandeliers, new paintings, new rooms for new entertainments. The throne had moved uptown. But the world that had made the throne meaningful was dissolving. Ward McAllister was dead. The man who had built the machinery of exclusion had died unmourned by the machine he'd built. Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who had forced Caroline's hand, had moved on to larger battles, to the suffrage movement, to the fight for women's right to vote, channeling the combative energy that had won the costume ball into something that would outlast all of the balls. The 400 was still 400, but the number now felt almost nostalgic. The new money had not broken down the doors. It had simply built more rooms and invited everyone into those instead. Caroline Astor continued. She descended her staircase. She took her position. She received her guests. The season continued. The balls were held. The food came on silver plate, and the champagne was the best available. But something had shifted in the quality of the air. The great certainty that had underlain everything, the certainty that the wall was real and the list was meaningful and the people inside it were the people who mattered, that certainty was not what it had been. You could feel it, in the way people spoke about society events, in the way the newspapers covered them, in the slight change in register between reverence and irony. The system still operated, but it was beginning to feel like performance. In the fall of 1906, Caroline Astor suffered what the society papers carefully described as a nervous breakdown. She was 75 years old. The precise clinical nature of her decline was not discussed publicly. That was not how these things were handled in her world. But those close to her understood that her mind was retreating from the present into a past that had become for her more real than anything happening around her. The past was 1880. The past was 1875. The past was the height of the 400, the peak of her power, the years when her judgment determined the social shape of the most important city in America. She began to live there. Through 1907, her daily carriage rides through Central Park became something that her family watched with the kind of quiet grief that attaches to watching someone you love disappear while still present. She would turn in her seat and incline her head at empty spaces on the path, nodding to people who were not there, greeting guests who had died years ago, some of them decades ago, with the same gracious acknowledgement she had always extended to those she found worthy of her notice. She was still receiving. She would always be receiving. At home, in the mansion on 65th Street, the staff faced a situation for which there was no protocol and no precedent. She continued to plan her entertainments. Menus were prepared for dinners that would not occur. Invitations were drafted for balls that would not be held. Social arrangements were made for evenings that existed only in the architecture of her deteriorating memory. Her family and the household staff made a decision. They did not tell her the parties were not happening. They did not explain that the guests she was expecting had predeceased her by decades. They set aside the menus and the invitations. They maintained the fiction. They let her live in the season that would never end, hosting the guests who would never arrive. Because what else could you do? She was Caroline Astor. She was always entertaining. In a more severe phase of her decline, she became convinced she was pregnant. A nursery was prepared in the house on 65th Street. She was 76 years old. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, the man who had built the Astoria Hotel in her name, announced in the summer of 1907 that she would not be opening her Newport Villa, Beechwood, for the season. He gave no detailed explanation. He didn't need to. Society understood the language. The absence of the season was an acknowledgement of what everyone in her circle already knew. The woman who decided who mattered was no longer present. She died on October 30th, 1908. She was 78 years old. It was 7:30 in the evening. Only her daughter was in the room. She was buried in the Astor Mausoleum at Trinity Cemetery in Manhattan. After her death, her social role, the specific function she had performed, the question of who would now decide who mattered, was divided among 3 women, including Alva, including the woman whose carriage had arrived at Alva's door 25 years earlier, demanding an invitation. The Waldorf Astoria stood for 36 years. It became everything neither of its creators had intended, and something far greater than either of them had imagined when they commissioned it from opposite sides of a family feud. The most famous hotel in the world, the address that replaced the address. Presidents stayed there. Kings stayed there. Every visiting dignitary of consequence stayed there. Peacock Alley became a permanent feature of New York social life, not the exclusive invitation-only theater of Caroline Astor's ballroom, but a public theater, a performance space where wealth and aspiration mixed without gates or lists. For a generation, it was magnificent. Then the numbers changed. December 20th, 1928. Buried in the financial news of a day whose headlines were focused on the extraordinary bull market that had been running for years and showed no signs of stopping, the Waldorf Astoria was sold. The announcement came on December 23rd. The buyers were the Boomer DuPont Properties Corporation. The price was $13.5 million for a building appraised at $5 million. The buyers' intentions were transparent. They were going to knock it down. The hotel that had been built out of family spite, that accidentally become one of the most significant buildings in America, that had outlasted every one of the people whose hatred had brought it into existence, the Waldorf Astoria was going to be demolished. The wrecking crews arrived on October 1st, 1929. 28 days later, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday arrived. The stock market collapsed in a single catastrophic day. the economic system that had built the Vanderbilt fortune and the Astor dynasty, that had funded every chandelier and every stomacher and every pearl-strung ceiling in every mansion in Newport and on Fifth Avenue and in every great house that had defined the Gilded Age, that system came apart. The Waldorf Astoria came down as the world that had made it possible destroyed itself. The wrecking crews cost $900,000. The salvaged materials, the fixtures, the fittings, the marble, the iron, everything that could be stripped from a hotel and sold, recovered $150,000. The building that had cost millions to construct, that had been the center of New York social life for 3 decades, was worth less in parts than it had cost to knock it down. The men who demolished it needed the work. The Great Depression had arrived. Unemployment was climbing past 20% in some cities. Men who had been earning middle-class wages in 1928 were standing in bread lines by 1930. The construction workers who demolished the Waldorf Astoria and then built what replaced it worked for wages that would have been considered insufficient even a few years earlier. The Empire State Building rose on the site. It cost $40.9 million, under its $60 million budget, largely because the Depression had made labor so cheap. Workers desperate enough for any employment accepted wages that would not have been acceptable in the prosperity of the late 1920s. The tallest building in the world, which it would remain for decades, was built in part because the men who built it had no better options. The Gilded Age was demolished at a discount. Its replacement was built by men who could not afford to eat. Think about that for a moment. The building that rose where Caroline Astor's world had stood, where her throne had been, where her pearled chandeliers had hung, where the 400 had danced to music played by hidden musicians behind Chinese screens. That building was made possible in part by the poverty of the people who constructed it. The most famous skyscraper in the world, built on the bones of the most exclusive neighborhood in America, by people who would never have been allowed inside either. Across Fifth Avenue and uptown, the other Astor addresses were disappearing. The mansion on 65th Street, the house where Caroline had moved after William Waldorf's hotel had driven her from 34th Street, the house where she had hosted her final seasons, where she had planned parties for the dead in her last years, was demolished. In its place, in 1929, the same year the Waldorf Astoria came down, the Temple Emmanuel was built, one of the largest Jewish houses of worship in the world, on the ground where the woman who had decided who mattered in America had held her final court. The irony of this, the specific, deliberate irony of it, is almost too complete to feel accidental. The most exclusive private address in New York City, replaced by a house of worship open to an entire community that Caroline Astor's world had regarded at best condescension and at worst something considerably darker. The wall and everything on it was gone. New York City, today. Stand on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. Look up. The Empire State Building rises 1,454 feet above you, 102 floors, more than 3 million visitors per year. They come from every country, every background, every economic circumstance that allows them to afford the price of a ticket. They stand in line together, a line without a guest list, without a socially determined hierarchy of who gets to be closer to the front. They ride the elevator to the observation deck and look out over the city in every direction. They do not need to be on any list. 3 blocks north, the Temple Emmanuel stands where Caroline Astor's final throne stood. The original Astor mansion on 34th Street is gone. The second mansion on 65th Street is gone. The Waldorf Astoria is gone. Newport's Beechwood has passed through uncertain decades. What remains of Caroline Astor's world is a cenotaph, the Astor Cross, erected in her memory in 1914 by her daughter Carrie at Trinity Churchyard, and a phrase, the 400, still used, still understood, still defining the idea that inside every social world there is a list, and on the list there are names, and some names are on it, and some are not. She invented that. Whatever else she was, whatever we think of the walls she built and the people she kept outside it, she invented that. She turned an idea that had existed everywhere in every society since the beginning of human social organization into something explicit and named and permanent. The 400 was her contribution to the language. It outlived everything else she built. Ward McAllister died alone at his club, unmourned by the system he had constructed. Alva Vanderbilt died in 1933, having spent her final decades fighting for women's suffrage with the same ferocity she had brought to the costume ball. She was present when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. The wall she had broken in 1883 was small compared to the wall that fell in 1920. She understood the difference and spent her later years making sure people knew it. Consuelo Vanderbilt escaped her duke, eventually secured an annulment, married for love the second time, and lived until 1964. She wrote her memoir. She told the truth. The glitter and the gold. Both things were real. Both things cost something. William Waldorf Astor became the first Viscount Astor of Hever Castle. His son became the second Viscount. His descendants are English aristocracy. He got, in the end, exactly what he wanted, just not in the country where he was born, and not in the way he had imagined it. His famous statement, "America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live," has followed him through history as the most expensive exit line in the record of American social life. John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline's son, who had built the Astoria Hotel and managed her decline with whatever grace he could muster, died on April 15, 1912. The RMS Titanic, the great ship built by the same Gilded Age confidence that had built the mansions and the hotels and the costume balls, the confidence that human beings could construct something so magnificently engineered that the ocean itself could not damage it, went down in the North Atlantic. He went down with it. The family's great American chapter ended in the cold water of the Atlantic, 2 years before the Astor Cross was erected in Caroline's memory, and 4 years before the Pisgah National Forest was created from George Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate, and 18 years before the wrecking crews arrived at the Waldorf Astoria. It all went, one way or another, in the same direction. In her final months, in the silence of her empty house on 65th Street, Caroline Astor descended her staircase in her finest gowns and her best jewels, and moved through the rooms where her guests were waiting for her. She greeted them, she acknowledged them, she received them in the manner that had defined her entire adult life. The rooms were empty. The guests existed only in the past that had become for her more real than the present. She was still Mrs. Astor. She was always receiving. Before her world ended entirely, she said one thing that history has chosen to remember, a statement made when she was leaving her old life on 34th Street, displaced by her nephew's hotel, heading uptown to start again in a house that would be grander than the one she was leaving, but somehow less certain of what it meant. Many women will rise up to fill my place. They didn't, not because no one tried, because the place itself was demolished. The dais was sold for salvage, the mansion torn down, the Astor coat of arms, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, buried under the foundations of something that would admit anyone who could afford a room. Here is the question this story leaves behind. Caroline Astor built a wall. She decided who mattered and who did not, and she enforced that decision with the full weight of her wealth and her social authority for 30 years. And then Alva Vanderbilt found the key, and William Waldorf found a way to demolish the house without touching the wall, and the Depression found the wrecking ball. Was she wrong? Not in the simple way the question implies. Every human community builds walls. Every social world decides who belongs. Every group of people who gather for a shared purpose draws, at some point, a line that separates those inside from those outside. The 400 was the most explicit, the most formalized, the most ruthlessly honest version of something that exists everywhere, in every workplace hierarchy, every social group, every community that has ever decided it valued something and wanted to protect it from dilution. The difference is that Caroline Astor's wall was built on a fiction. The fiction that old money was better than new money, that blood was more meaningful than achievement, that the accident of birth was a more reliable indicator of worth than anything a person could actually do or make or become. Alva Vanderbilt did not tear that fiction down. She replaced it with a different fiction, that the truly spectacular display of wealth was its own form of aristocracy. She moved the wall rather than removing it. The Empire State Building moved it again. And the line at the elevator, the line where nobody asks who you are or where your family came from or whether you were on the list, that line is the closest thing this story has to a resolution. Not an ending, not a triumph, just a different kind of wall, lower and slower and made of something less permanent than marble. Walk Fifth Avenue today. Look at the building where the throne once stood, the building that replaced the hotel, that replaced the mansion that held the ballroom, where Caroline Astor received the people she had decided mattered. Ask it. It was here for everything. The 400, the forced visit, the hotel war, the demolition, the depression, the tower rising from the rubble, the men who built the tower on wages that would have embarrassed the women who danced in the ballroom below. It remembers the pearls strung between the chandeliers. It remembers the empty room. It remembers the woman on the throne, nodding at guests who were no longer there. It is still here. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age families and the worlds they built and destroyed, please like this video and subscribe to Ledger and Stone. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments which story to investigate next, the Vanderbilts of Newport, the Astors of England, or perhaps something unexpected, a name history has nearly forgotten, a house that deserved better than it got, a family whose story has never been told the way it deserves. These places aren't just buildings. They are the places where America decided what it was. Every mansion has its shadows. Every throne has its expiration date. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.